The archaeological team vanished 3 days after breaking through to the deepest chamber, and when the military recovery unit found them a week later, all 12 members were alive but standing in perfect silence in a circle around a massive stone sarcophagus. Their eyes open but unseeing, their mouths moving in synchronized whispers that formed words in a language older than Sumerian. The medics couldn't break their formation. Whenever someone tried to pull a team member away, all 12 would scream in unison and their bodies would begin to smoke as if burning from the inside, forcing the rescuers to leave them in their terrible vigil. And carved into every surface of the cave chamber were the same message repeated millions of times in every language that had ever existed. We spoke it into being. We gave it words. We taught it language. Now it speaks through us. It speaks through everyone. You are already repeating its words without knowing. The entity they had awakened wasn't physical. It was linguistic, a conscious pattern that existed in language itself. And by reading the inscriptions aloud during their exploration, the archaeologists had released it from a prison of enforced silence that had contained it for 12,000 years. And the entity spread through communication, infecting anyone who heard its words and turning them into transmitters, forcing them to speak its phrases to others, propagating itself through human conversation like a virus that traveled on sound waves. Within 2 weeks of the cave opening, 47,000 people across Syria, Turkey, and Iraq had been infected, standing in public squares speaking the entity's words in perfect synchronization, and linguistic analysis revealed the horrifying purpose. The entity was using humanity to speak itself into physical form, each infected person serving as a vocal component in a vast incantation that would give it a body when enough voices joined the chorus. And according to infection rate projections, the entity would achieve critical mass, enough speakers to complete its manifestation in approximately 3 months. That was the official report. I know because I wrote it. My name is Gabriel Ashworth, and 6 weeks ago I was a linguistics consultant for DARPA's Advanced Threat Assessment Division, specializing in ancient Semitic languages and pre-cuneiform writing systems. They flew me to Damascus on a cargo plane that smelled like diesel and old blood, handed me a tablet containing audio files that would change everything I understood about human consciousness, and asked me one simple question: "Can you translate it?" And I said yes. I wish to God I'd said no. I wish I'd never learned to read. I wish I'd been born deaf and mute in some quiet corner of the world where words couldn't reach me. But here's what the report didn't include, what I couldn't bring myself to document. The real horror isn't that something spreads through language. The horror is what I discovered about where language actually comes from, and why we were always meant to find that cave beneath the Syrian desert. 6 weeks earlier, the transport touched down at Al-Kamishli airfield just after sunset. The heat rose from the tarmac in waves that made the distant hangars shimmer like mirages, and I remember thinking that Syria in August felt like standing inside someone's mouth. A man waited for me at the bottom of the cargo ramp, tall, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped blonde hair going grey at the temples, and the kind of weathered tan you only get from years in places where the sun wants to kill you. He wore civilian clothes, khaki pants, a loose linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up, but everything about the way he carried himself screamed military. "Dr. Ashworth?" His handshake was firm, professional. "I'm Tobias Vance, Defense Intelligence Agency. I'll be your handler for the duration." Handler. I shouldered my bag, squinting against the dying light. That's an interesting word choice. It's an interesting situation. He led me toward a waiting SUV, its windows tinted black. What did they tell you stateside? Almost nothing. Ancient inscriptions, possible pre-Sumerian origin. Audio samples that need translation. I climbed into the passenger seat, grateful for the air conditioning. They were light on details. Vance started the engine but didn't move. He sat there for a moment, hands on the wheel, jaw working like he was chewing on something he didn't want to swallow. "The dig site is about 40 kilometers southwest of here," he said finally, "near the Euphrates, in what used to be the Jazeera region. Farmers found the cave system last spring when a sinkhole opened up and swallowed 3 of their goats. Syrian Antiquities Authority sent a team to investigate. They found chambers that go down almost 200 meters. That's unusually deep for this region. Everything about this site is unusual, Doctor. He pulled the SUV onto a cracked asphalt road that cut through brown scrubland. The team reached the lowest chamber 9 days ago, broke through a sealed entrance that had been deliberately collapsed sometime in the late Neolithic period. Someone went to a lot of trouble to make sure that rooms stayed closed. I watched the landscape scroll past, flat, sparse, scattered with the occasional mud brick dwelling. And the audio samples? Recorded 4 days ago before the team went silent. Vance reached into the center console and pulled out a small digital recorder. We've had 3 linguists listen to these already. 2 of them couldn't identify the language. The third said it wasn't possible. What wasn't possible? The phoneme structure. He said no human vocal apparatus could produce those sounds naturally. Vance glanced at me, his eyes unreadable in the dim light. Then he asked to be removed from the project. Wouldn't say why. Just kept repeating that he didn't want to hear it again. He handed me the recorder. It was warm from sitting in the console and heavier than I expected. Don't play it now, Vance said. Wait until we reach the forward operating base. We've got containment protocols. Containment protocols for an audio recording. For whatever's on that recording. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. Dr. Ashworth, I've been in this business for 23 years. I've seen things in Afghanistan, Iraq, places that don't officially exist. Things that made me question what I thought I knew about the world. But this... He trailed off, shaking his head. The team we sent to recover the archaeologists, 6 men, all experienced, all solid. They came back wrong. Wrong how? They won't stop talking, haven't slept in 3 days. They just keep reciting something over and over. Different words, same rhythm. Like they're all reading from the same script, but each got a different page. He pulled the SUV through a checkpoint manned by soldiers who looked too young and too frightened. The base psychiatrist thinks it's some kind of shared psychotic break. Mass hysteria triggered by trauma. What do you think? Vance was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost vulnerable in a way that seemed foreign to his weathered face. I think whatever's in that cave has been waiting a very long time for someone to open the door, and I think it's happy we finally did. We drove the rest of the way in silence. The sun had fully set by the time we reached the forward operating base, a cluster of temporary structures surrounded by razor wire and floodlights that turned the desert white. Soldiers moved between buildings with the tense efficiency of people who knew something was wrong but couldn't name it. Vance parked near a prefab unit marked with red biohazard symbols and led me inside. The interior was clinical, sterile, filled with equipment I didn't recognize, and monitors displaying waveforms that made no sense. And in the center of the room, behind a glass partition, sat a man in a hospital gown. His lips were moving constantly, forming words I couldn't hear through the soundproof barrier. His eyes were open, but focused on something far beyond the walls of his containment cell. That's Dr. Hector Morrow, Vance said quietly. He was the lead archaeologist, the one who first read the inscriptions aloud. I stepped closer to the glass. Morrow's face was gaunt, his cheeks hollow, his skin carrying an unhealthy grey pallor, but it was his hands that caught my attention. The way his fingers kept tracing patterns in the air over and over like he was writing something only he could see. He hasn't stopped since we brought him back, Vance continued. None of them have. They don't eat. They barely drink. They just keep speaking. I pressed my palm against the cool glass. Morrow's head turned slowly, deliberately, his empty eyes finding mine with a precision that shouldn't have been possible for someone in his condition. His lips formed a single word, and even through the soundproofing, even through the barrier that was supposed to protect me from whatever had taken hold of him, I understood it perfectly. My name. They gave me an isolation room with foam-padded walls and a single chair bolted to the floor. The recorder sat on a metal table in front of me, innocent as a paperweight, waiting. Standard protocol, Vance explained through the intercom. Anyone exposed to the audio gets monitored for 72 hours afterward. We'll be watching through the cameras. And if I start reciting like the others? Then we'll know the containment works. His voice carried no humor. Headphones are in the drawer. When you're ready. I sat alone in that padded cell for nearly 10 minutes before I found the courage to open the drawer. The headphones were military-grade, noise-cancelling, the kind designed to block out everything except what was being piped directly into your ears. I put them on and the world went silent. My thumb hovered over the play button. I'd spent my entire career studying dead languages. Akkadian, Ugaritic, Proto-Sinaitic, tongues that hadn't been spoken in millennia, preserved only in clay tablets and weathered stone. I'd always found comfort in their silence. They were puzzles to be solved, not conversations to be had. The people who spoke them were long gone, their words reduced to academic curiosities. But whatever was on this recording wasn't dead. I could feel it somehow, a presence waiting behind the static, patient as stone. I pressed play. The first 30 seconds were ambient noise, footsteps echoing in a large space, the drip of water, distant voices speaking Arabic. Then someone said something in English, muffled but recognizable. Recording now, chamber 7, lowest level, a pause. The sound of breathing, harsh and quick with excitement or fear. Then the voice began. It wasn't human, I knew that immediately, with a certainty that bypassed logic entirely. The sounds were wrong, not just unfamiliar but impossible. Frequencies that seemed to fold back on themselves, consonants that clicked in patterns no throat could produce, vowels that rose and fell like something alive. And underneath it all, a rhythm. A cadence that pulled at something deep in my brainstem, something older than thought. I found myself leaning forward, straining to hear. The words, if they were words, seemed to shimmer at the edge of comprehension. I almost understood them. Almost. Like a name you've forgotten, hovering just beyond reach. The recording lasted 4 minutes and 18 seconds. When it ended, I sat in silence, my hands trembling, sweat cooling on my forehead. I removed the headphones and became aware of my own heartbeat, loud and irregular in my chest. "Dr. Ashworth," Vance's voice through the intercom. "How do you feel?" "I need to hear it again." A long pause. "That's not recommended." "I need to hear it again." I didn't recognize my own voice. It sounded hungry. "There's something there. A pattern. I almost had it." That's what the third linguist said right before he asked to be removed. I'm not him. I put the headphones back on, my fingers finding the play button with disturbing ease. One more time. The second listening was different. The sounds that had seemed random before began to organize themselves, revealing structure, grammar, syntax. This wasn't glossolalia or audio corruption. It was language, complex, sophisticated, and ancient beyond anything I'd encountered. But it was the repetition that caught me. Certain phoneme clusters kept recurring, spaced at precise intervals throughout the recording. Like a heartbeat, like breathing, like something marking time. When the recording ended the second time, I pulled off the headphones and spoke without thinking. "It's counting." "What?" Vance's voice sharp with alarm. "The repeating elements. They're not vocabulary, they're numbers. It's counting something." I stared at the recorder, my reflection distorted in its chrome surface. Or counting down. They kept me in the isolation room for another 6 hours, running tests, asking questions I couldn't answer. When they finally let me out, the sun was rising over the desert, painting the prefab buildings in shades of gold and rust. A man was waiting for me outside the containment unit, younger than Vance, maybe early 30s, with dark curly hair and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look more like a graduate student than whatever he actually was. He wore a rumpled Oxford shirt with the sleeves rolled up and had the pale complexion of someone who spent too much time indoors. "Dr. Ashworth," he extended his hand. "I'm Julian Cross, Computational Linguistics, MIT. They flew me in yesterday when the pattern recognition software flagged something in the audio." "Flagged what?" "That's the thing." He fell into step beside me as I walked toward the mess hall, my stomach growling despite everything. The software couldn't identify either, but it recognized the structure, said there was a 97% correlation with known language architecture. Known language architecture. Every human language follows certain universal patterns, Chomsky's work mostly, the idea that grammar is hardwired into our brains. The audio matches those patterns perfectly. Julian pushed his glasses up his nose, a nervous habit I'd noticed many more times in the days to come. But the phonemes themselves don't appear in any language database. Not living, not dead, not reconstructed. It's like finding a building that follows all the rules of architecture but is made from materials that don't exist. We reached the mess hall, a long tent filled with folding tables and the smell of powdered eggs. Soldiers sat in clusters, eating in near silence, their conversations muted and tense. Whatever was happening at this base, word had spread. I grabbed a tray and loaded it with whatever was available, suddenly ravenous in a way that felt almost primal. "You listened to it," Julian said, sliding onto the bench across from me. It wasn't a question. "Twice." "And you're still thinking clearly." He watched my face with an intensity that felt almost clinical, his dark eyes tracking every micro-expression. "That's interesting. Most people who hear it more than once start showing symptoms within a few hours." "What kind of symptoms?" "Echolalia, compulsive repetition of certain sounds. The infected, that's what we're calling them. The infected, they all start the same way. Just little fragments, worked into normal speech. Then the fragments get longer. Then normal speech disappears entirely." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "But you seem fine. More than fine, actually. You seem energized." I thought about the hunger I'd felt, the desperate need to hear the recording again, the way the sounds had started to organize themselves in my mind, revealing their hidden architecture like a flower blooming in time-lapse. I thought about how natural it had felt, how right, as if some part of me had been waiting my whole life to hear those impossible syllables. "Define fine," I said. Julian held my gaze for a moment longer than comfortable. There was something in his eyes. Curiosity, yes, but something else too. Something that looked almost like hope, or maybe recognition. Like he'd found a kindred spirit in the last place he expected. "The inscription on the sarcophagus," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the mess hall. "The one the archaeologists read aloud before everything went wrong. I've been working on a translation using the pattern structures we identified." "And?" "It's not a warning. Everyone assumed it was a warning. Don't open, danger inside, that sort of thing. Standard tomb inscription format. But that's not what it says." He glanced around, making sure no one was within earshot, then leaned even closer. I could smell his aftershave. Something subtle and woody that seemed out of place in this utilitarian environment. "It says, 'Here sleeps the first word, the word that spoke all other words into being, the word that made mouths to speak it and ears to hear it. Do not wake it. Do not speak it. Do not let it remember that you exist.'" The eggs turned to ash in my mouth. "The first word," I repeated slowly, testing how the concept felt on my tongue. "The first word." Julian's voice dropped even lower, intimate now, conspiratorial. "Dr. Ashworth, what if language didn't evolve? What if it was given to us, implanted, like a seed in fertile soil? And what if the thing that gave it to us has been sleeping under the Syrian desert for 12,000 years, waiting for us to learn enough words to finally wake it up?" I set down my fork, my appetite suddenly gone. "That's insane." "Is it?" His eyes never left mine. 60,000 years ago, humans were anatomically identical to us, but behaviorally primitive. No art, no complex tools, no symbolic thinking. Then suddenly, everything changed. The cognitive revolution. We started painting caves, crafting jewelry, burying our dead with ritual. We started thinking in abstractions. He paused. We started talking. That's called behavioral modernity. It's well documented. It's well documented and completely unexplained. Julian smiled, but there was no warmth in it. What if something taught us? What if the first word was a key, and speaking it opened a door in our minds that could never be closed again? The containment wing held all 12 archaeologists in separate cells, arranged in a circle around a central monitoring station. Julian had secured us access through channels he wouldn't explain. and we stood now at the hub of that wheel, surrounded by glass walls and the soft murmur of a dozen voices speaking in unison. "They're synchronized," I said, watching the nearest subject, a young man whose file identified him as Theodore Blackwood, graduate assistant from Oxford. His lips moved in perfect time with the others, forming syllables I almost recognized. How is that possible? They can't hear each other through the soundproofing. They couldn't at first. Julian checked something on his tablet, his face underlit by the screen's glow. For the first 3 days, they each spoke different fragments, random, chaotic. Then on day 4, they started converging. By day 5, they were perfectly synchronized. Every word, every pause, every breath. Like instruments tuning to the same frequency. Exactly like that. He looked up at me, and in the dim light his eyes seemed darker than before. "Dr. Ashworth, Gabriel, there's something I haven't told you. Something the official reports don't include." I waited. The synchronization isn't just happening here. Reports started coming in yesterday from Aleppo, Damascus, even as far as Ankara. People who had no contact with the dig site, no exposure to the recordings, suddenly stopping in the middle of their daily routines and beginning to speak. The same words, the same rhythm. He swallowed hard. At the exact same moment that our subjects here shifted into their final pattern. It's spreading without direct transmission. It's spreading through language itself. Anyone who's heard the infected speak, anyone who's read transcripts of what they're saying, anyone who's even thought too hard about the patterns, they become carriers. And they don't even know it until it's too late. I thought about the recording I'd listened to. Twice. The hunger I'd felt afterward, the desperate need to hear it again. The way certain sounds had begun appearing in my thoughts at odd moments, while showering, while eating, while trying to sleep. "Julian," my voice came out steadier than I felt. "Have you been tested?" "Every 6 hours, still clean." He attempted a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You?" "I don't know." I pressed my palm against the glass of Theodore Blackwood's cell. The young man's head turned slowly, tracking the movement, though his lips never stopped their endless recitation. "I keep hearing fragments, just little pieces, like a song stuck in my head. I thought it was normal. Memory artifacts from the recording." "What fragments?" I opened my mouth to tell him and stopped. The sounds were there, waiting on my tongue, eager to be spoken. It would be so easy to let them out. So natural. Like exhaling after holding your breath too long. "I can't," I said instead. "If I say them out loud, you might spread it." Julian nodded slowly. "That's good. That's self-awareness. The infected don't have that. They can't stop themselves." He moved closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him in the climate-controlled chill of the monitoring station. "We need to get you into isolation. Run the full battery of tests." "Not yet." I pulled my hand back from the glass. "I need to understand what's happening first. The counting I heard in the original recording, has it continued?" Julian's expression shifted. "That's the other thing I haven't told you. The counting isn't random. It's correlated to infection rates. Every time the count decreases by 1, approximately 2,000 new people enter the synchronized speaking state somewhere in the world. It's tracking its own spread. More than that, it's measuring toward a goal. The initial count was somewhere around 40,000. As of this morning, it's down to 32,000 and change." He pulled up something on his tablet and showed me a graph, a steadily declining line that looked like it would hit 0 in approximately 11 weeks. "When it reaches 0, when enough people are speaking in unison, critical mass," I finished, "enough voices to complete the incantation. To speak it into physical form." Julian's voice had dropped to barely a whisper. "Whatever's been sleeping in that cave, whatever gave us language in the first place, it's using us to build itself a body. Every infected person is a syllable, and when enough syllables come together..." He trailed off, but I could finish the thought myself. When enough syllables come together, they form a word. And some words, spoken with enough voices, have the power to reshape reality. The ancient Sumerians believed that names had power, I said slowly. That to know the true name of something was to control it. But what if they had it backward? What if names don't give us power over things? What if they give things power over us? The oldest prison ever built, Julian murmured. Not walls or chains, just silence. 12,000 years of enforced quiet, and we let it out because we couldn't resist reading what was on the walls. A sound interrupted him, soft at first, then building. A harmonic resonance that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I realized with horror that all 12 archaeologists had shifted their pitch, their synchronized whispers rising into something that was almost singing. The sound waves seemed to vibrate in my chest, resonating with something deep inside me that I hadn't known was there. Then Theodore Blackwood began to glow. There's no other word for it. Light emanated from beneath his skin. Not bright, but somehow wrong, as if illumination were leaking from somewhere that wasn't supposed to have any. His veins stood out in traceries of pale luminescence, mapping rivers of something that wasn't quite blood anymore. What's happening? I stepped back from the glass, my heart hammering. I don't know. Julian was already on his radio calling for medical teams, but I could hear the fear in his voice. This is new. This hasn't happened before. The light intensified. Blackwood's mouth opened wider than should have been possible, his jaw unhinging like a snake's, and from his throat came a sound that bypassed my ears entirely and went straight into my brain. I understood it. God help me, I understood every word. He was saying, almost home, the door is opening. The house remembers its children. Almost home. And then Theodore Blackwood collapsed in on himself. It wasn't violent, it wasn't even fast. He simply folded, his body compressing like paper being crumpled by an invisible hand, his luminescent form shrinking and condensing until all that remained was a small, dark object lying on the floor of his cell. Julian and I stood frozen as the medical team burst in, as alarms began shrieking, as the other 11 archaeologists continued their synchronized chant without pause or acknowledgement of what had just happened to their companion. What is that? Julian pressed against the glass, trying to see. What did he become? One of the medics, braver or more foolish than the others, entered Blackwood's cell through the airlock. He approached the object on the floor, knelt down, and picked it up. It was a clay tablet, small, roughly rectangular, covered in dense cuneiform script that seemed to shift and writhe in the fluorescent light. It transformed him, I heard myself say. It used him up and turned him into a word. A word? A component, a piece of its body. I couldn't look away from the tablet in the medic's hands. Part of me, a growing part, wanted desperately to read what was written there, to speak it aloud, to add my voice to the chorus. Julian, we need to leave. We need to leave right now. But Julian wasn't listening. He was staring at his own hands, holding them up in front of his face with an expression of dawning horror. His fingertips were glowing. Gabriel. His voice cracked on my name. Gabriel. I can hear it. I can hear what they're saying. When did I start hearing it? Julian, it sounds like home. Tears were streaming down his face now, but he was smiling, and the smile was the worst part because it looked genuine. It sounds like going home after being lost for so long. Don't you hear it? Can't you hear how beautiful it is? I grabbed him by the shoulders and shook him hard. Julian, listen to me. Focus on my voice. Whatever you're hearing, it's not real. It's not beautiful. It's a trap. But it knows my name. His eyes met mine, and the light behind them wasn't reflected from anything in the room. It knows all our names. It named us, Gabriel. 60,000 years ago, it gave us the words for ourselves. And now it wants them back. His legs buckled. I caught him before he hit the floor, holding him against my chest as the glow spread from his fingertips up his wrists, as his lips began to move in patterns I recognized from the recording, from the archaeologists, from the fragments that had been echoing in my own head since I first pressed play. He was lighter than I expected, or maybe I was stronger than I knew. Adrenaline, fear, something else I didn't want to name. Julian, stay with me. I was begging now, my voice raw with desperation I couldn't hide. "Please, fight it. Stay with me." "I'm sorry," he whispered, and for a moment, just a moment, the light receded and his eyes cleared and he was himself again. Present, aware, terrified. "I wanted more time. I wanted to know you better. I wanted..." He reached up and touched my face, his luminescent fingers leaving trails of warmth on my cheek. The touch was gentle, almost tender, and I understood what he was trying to say in that final moment. What we might have had in a different world with more time. Then the glow consumed him entirely and I was left holding a clay tablet still warm from its transformation, covered in words I understood perfectly but would never dare speak aloud. The tablet was heavy in my hands, heavier than it should have been, as if it contained not just symbols but the weight of a human life condensed into meaning. I was alone in the monitoring station. The remaining 11 archaeologists continued their endless recitation, unmoved by the loss of 2 of their number. The alarms had stopped, the medical team had retreated, and somewhere in the distance I could hear more voices joining the chorus. Soldiers, support staff, anyone who had heard enough, understood enough. And somewhere deep in my skull, behind my eyes, in the quiet place where language lives, something was beginning to wake up. I found Vance in the command center, standing before a wall of monitors that showed feeds from across the region: Damascus, Aleppo, Mosul, Ankara. In each city, clusters of people had stopped in public spaces, markets, intersections, mosques, and begun speaking in unison. The feeds had no audio, but I could see their lips moving in the same rhythm I'd come to know so well. 47,000, Vance said without turning around. That was the count this morning. It's over 60,000 now, doubling every 18 hours. I still held Julian's tablet in my hands. I couldn't bring myself to put it down. Dr. Cross is dead. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears. Blackwood too, they didn't just die, they transformed, became these. I held up the tablet. The thing in the cave is building itself from human beings. Vance finally turned. His face was grey, exhausted, but his eyes held something I hadn't expected. Recognition. "We know," he said quietly. "You know. This isn't the first time it's happened, Dr. Ashworth." He moved to a locked cabinet, entered a code, and withdrew a metal case. Inside, nestled in foam padding, were 3 more clay tablets. Göbekli Tepe, 1994. A construction crew broke through to a sealed chamber. 7 workers transformed before we could contain it. Derinkuyu, 2003. An archaeological survey, 12 researchers, same result. He gestured at the tablets. We've been collecting these for 30 years, trying to understand what we're dealing with. And you sent me in anyway, knowing what could happen? We sent you because you're different. Vance closed the case and met my gaze. The 3rd linguist who listened to the recording, the one who asked to be removed. He started showing symptoms within 2 hours. Echolalia, compulsive repetition, the whole progression. You've been exposed for over 24 hours and you're still having this conversation. I thought about the fragments circling in my head, the hunger to hear the recording again, the way I'd understood Blackwood's final words perfectly, without translation. I'm not immune, I said. I can feel it. Growing. But you're not gone yet. That makes you valuable. Vance stepped closer, lowering his voice even though we were alone. There's a theory. The people who transform fastest, they're the ones who resist, who try to block out the signal. But the ones who engage with it, who try to understand it on their own terms, they last longer, sometimes much longer. You want me to keep listening. I want you to translate. He pulled up a file on the nearest monitor, dense lines of cuneiform, thousands of characters photographed from the cave walls. The inscriptions go back 12,000 years, but they're not all the same age. Some are ancient, some are newer, added over time in different hands, different styles, as if people have been visiting that cave throughout history, adding to the record. I studied the images, my linguist's eye automatically parsing patterns, He was right. The writing showed clear evolution, from crude early forms to more sophisticated later additions. What does it say? That's what we need you to tell us. Because the newest inscriptions, the ones that appear to be only a few centuries old, they're not warnings. They look like instructions. Instructions for what? Vance pulled up another image. This one showed a section of wall I hadn't seen before, covered in geometric patterns surrounding a central figure. The figure was humanoid but wrong. Too many limbs, proportions that seemed to shift when I looked at them too long. A head that seemed to contain its own interior space like a room folded into itself. We think they're instructions for putting it back to sleep. The fragments in my head stirred, responding to the image like iron filings to a magnet. I could almost read the patterns, almost understand the geometry. The knowledge was there, just out of reach, waiting for me to open the door and let it in. Part of me wanted to. Part of me wanted nothing more than to surrender to that understanding, to let the boundaries of my mind dissolve into something larger and older and infinitely more complete. I forced myself to look away. Whoever built that prison, Vance continued, they knew it might escape eventually. They left a failsafe, a way to seal it again. But the instructions are written in the same language the thing uses to spread. To read them, to understand them, you have to let it into your mind. There's no other way. A trap, or a test. The people who added those later inscriptions, they were infected too, had to be, to write in that script. But they maintained enough of themselves to leave guidance for whoever came next. Generation after generation, across 12,000 years, people have been fighting this thing, adding to the record, building a manual for its containment. He paused, his weathered face showing something that might have been respect. We need someone who can walk that line, infected enough to read the instructions, human enough to carry them out. And if I can't? If I transform like the others? Vance's expression hardened into something cold and practical. Then we add another tablet to the collection and find someone else. We've been doing this for 30 years, Dr. Ashworth. You're not the first, you won't be the last. This is bigger than any individual, bigger than sentiment or grief or hope. The coldness of it should have shocked me. Instead, I felt a strange clarity. This was how it had to work. The thing in the cave was patient, had been patient for 12,000 years, and the only way to fight something that thought in millennia was with institutional persistence. One researcher at a time, each one pushing a little further before they fell, each one leaving notes for the next. Julian's tablet was warm in my hands. I wondered if his final thoughts were encoded somewhere in those symbols, if some fragment of him persisted in the cuneiform. The count, I said. Julian told me it was tied to infection rates. When it hits zero, we estimate somewhere between 8 and 12 million people will be speaking in unison. Enough voices to complete whatever incantation it's been building toward. Enough human consciousness converted into raw linguistic energy to give it physical form. How long? Current projections say 11 weeks, maybe less if the doubling rate accelerates. Vance pulled up one final image, a satellite photo of the Syrian desert, marked with coordinates. The cave is still open, the sarcophagus is still there. Whatever's inside hasn't moved because it doesn't need to. It's building its body from the outside in, using us as raw material. I stared at the photo. Somewhere beneath that sand, in a chamber that had been sealed since the Neolithic, something was waiting. Something that had given humanity the gift of language and was now collecting on a debt we never knew we owed. I thought about Julian's face in those final moments, the light consuming him from within, the words he'd never get to finish. I thought about the warmth of his touch on my cheek, already fading to memory. "I'll do it," I heard myself say. "I'll translate the instructions." Vance nodded slowly, no surprise in his expression. "There's a helicopter leaving for the site in 2 hours. I've already arranged your clearance. You'll have a security escort, medical support on standby, and a direct line to our linguistics team. Everything you need." You knew I'd agree. I knew you'd understand there was no other choice. He turned back to the monitors, to the spreading silence of synchronized voices across a dozen cities. "We all serve the word eventually, Dr. Ashworth. The only question is whether we choose how, whether we go willingly or get dragged. I thought about that as I left the command center, Julian's tablet pressed against my chest and the fragments in my head growing louder with every step. Outside, the Syrian night was vast and dark, the stars scattered across the sky like punctuation marks in a language I was only beginning to read. Somewhere out there, thousands of people were standing in the darkness, speaking words they didn't understand. In 2 hours, I would return to the cave where this all began. I would descend into the earth and face the thing that had been waiting for us since before civilization, since before writing, since before the first human being ever tried to make another understand what they were feeling. And I would learn to read the language of the thing that made us. The fragments whispered approval. They knew I was coming. I wondered if Julian had known too in those final moments, if the light that consumed him had shown him what was waiting at the end of all words, if he had been afraid, or if he had finally found the home he'd spoken of. I supposed I would find out soon enough. The helicopter touched down at the dig site just before dawn. The landscape below had been transformed since the first breach. What was once a simple archaeological camp was now a military installation, ringed with floodlights and razor wire and soldiers who wouldn't meet my eyes. 3 men accompanied me on the descent. Sergeant Nathaniel Drummond, a stocky career soldier with a shaved head and a perpetual scowl. Corporal August Fielding, younger and quieter, carrying enough surveillance equipment to film a documentary. And Dr. Winston Hargrove, a xenolinguist from some alphabet agency who specialized in what he called non-standard communication paradigms. We gathered at the cave entrance, a jagged wound in the earth that exhaled cold air smelling of copper and something older. Stone. Silence. Time compressed into geology. I could feel the fragments stirring in my head, responding to proximity like a compass needle swinging toward magnetic north. "Rules of engagement," Drummond said, checking his weapon with practiced efficiency. "No one reads anything aloud. No one speaks unless absolutely necessary. If you start feeling strange, confused, disoriented, compelled to vocalize, you signal immediately and we extract. Clear?" We all nodded. "Dr. Ashworth." Drummond fixed me with a hard stare, his jaw set in a way that suggested he'd seen too many missions go wrong. "You're the package. We get you to the lowest chamber, you do your translation work, we get you out. Anything goes sideways, you're the priority. Understood?" Understood. The descent took nearly 2 hours. The cave system was labyrinthine, a maze of natural passages expanded by ancient hands into something more deliberate. The temperature dropped as we went deeper, our breath misting in the beams of our headlamps. The walls grew smoother as we descended, the tool marks more precise, until we were walking through corridors that could have been carved yesterday, if not for the weight of millennia pressing down from above. And everywhere the inscriptions. They started sparse near the entrance, scattered symbols, fragments of meaning. But as we descended, they multiplied, covering every surface in dense layers of text that overlapped and interwove until the walls themselves seemed to writhe with language. My headlamp caught glimpses of cuneiform, hieroglyphics, scripts I didn't recognize, scripts that shouldn't exist, all saying the same thing in 1,000 different voices. The fragments in my head responded to each new inscription like tuning forks, resonating with sympathetic vibration. I could feel them growing stronger, more coherent, assembling themselves into something that wanted desperately to be understood. "Dr. Ashworth." Hargrove had moved up beside me, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're seeing it too, aren't you? The patterns?" I glanced at him. His face was pale in the artificial light, his eyes too bright. "I see text," I said carefully. "Nothing more." "Liar." But he smiled when he said it, a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've been studying these inscriptions for 3 years. 3 years of photographs and rubbings and spectral analysis. I know what it feels like when the patterns start making sense." "Is that why they sent you, as a control subject?" "They sent me because I'm already infected." He said it casually, like discussing a chronic illness. "Stage 2, according to their classification system. I can read approximately 40% of the primary script. Another few weeks and I'll be able to read it all." "And then?" And then I suppose I'll become very articulate." We continued in silence. The passage narrowed, then opened suddenly into a vast chamber that stole my breath. The ceiling vanished into darkness above. The walls curved inward like the interior of an egg. And in the center, exactly as the reports had described, stood the sarcophagus. It was massive, 12 feet long, carved from a single block of black stone that seemed to drink the light from our headlamps. The surface was covered in the same dense script as the walls, but arranged differently here. Concentrated, purposeful, like a legal document written by something that had never seen a human being but understood perfectly how we thought. The 11 remaining archaeologists stood around it in their perfect circle, mouths moving in their endless recitation. They had been here for weeks now, unfed and unmoving, sustained by something other than biology. Their skin had taken on a waxy translucence, and beneath it I could see the faint luminescence that had consumed Julian. They were transforming slowly, their bodies becoming vessels for something that didn't need flesh, except as a temporary scaffold. "Fielding, get your equipment set up." Drummond's voice was tight, controlled. "Hargrove, Ashworth, you have 90 minutes. Find what we need." I approached the sarcophagus, giving the archaeologists a wide berth. Their presence was unnerving, those slack faces, those moving lips, those eyes that tracked nothing and everything simultaneously. Up close, the inscriptions on the stone were even more intricate than I'd expected. Layers upon layers of meaning, each symbol containing depths that seemed to extend far beyond the physical surface. I had the unsettling sense that I wasn't reading the text so much as the text was reading me. Hargrove was already tracing the characters with his fingers, muttering to himself in fragments of languages I almost recognized. His movements were reverent, almost sensual, like a man rediscovering a lover's body after long absence. "Here," he said, pointing to a section near the base. "This is the oldest layer, the original seal. Everything else was added later." I knelt beside him, studying the indicated passage. The characters were crude compared to the later editions, but there was a brutal efficiency to them. Whoever had carved this wasn't interested in elegance. They were interested in containment. The fragments in my head surged forward, eager to help. I let them come. The translation assembled itself in my mind like a puzzle solving itself, each symbol slotting into place, each phoneme finding its partner, until meaning emerged from the chaos. "It's a binding," I said slowly, "not a prison, a binding. They didn't trap it, they tied it to this place, anchored it with words so that it couldn't leave, couldn't spread, couldn't grow." "How do we restore the binding?" "That's the thing." I moved around the sarcophagus, reading as I went, the fragments translating faster than I could consciously process. The binding wasn't just words, it was silence. For 12,000 years no one spoke in this chamber, no one read the inscriptions aloud. The thing inside was starving, cut off from the only sustenance it understands: human language, human communication, human meaning. And the archaeologists broke the silence. They fed it. For the first time in 12 millennia, it heard human voices speaking human words, and it remembered what it was. Hargrove had gone pale. "So, to restore the binding, we need to recreate the silence. We need to do more than that." I had reached the newest inscriptions now, the instructions Vance had mentioned, added by infected predecessors throughout history. The handwriting varied wildly, from the precise strokes of trained scribes to the desperate scratching of people running out of time. But the message was consistent. The original binding required a sacrifice, a voice freely given. Someone who chose to stop speaking forever, who chose to become part of the silence that contained it. A human anchor, a willing one. The thing can take voices by force. That's what it's doing now, converting people into syllables. But a voice that's given freely, a mind that chooses silence over speech, that's something it can't digest. It becomes a lock, a seal. I looked up and found Hargrove staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. "You knew," I said. "You already knew all of this." "I suspected." His voice had changed, the conversational warmth draining away into something colder and more ancient. "But I needed to be sure. Needed to hear it from someone the patterns hadn't fully claimed yet. Behind us, I heard Drummond swear. I turned to see Fielding lowering his camera, his movements mechanical, his lips beginning to move in the familiar, synchronized rhythm of the infected. "He listened too closely," Hargrove said. "They always do. The equipment picks up frequencies the human ear misses, but the brain still processes them. He's been watching the footage for months." "You planned this?" "We planned this." Hargrove smiled, and his teeth were too white in the darkness, and the light behind his eyes wasn't reflected from our headlamps. "Gabriel, did you really think you were brought here to stop what's happening? You were brought here to complete it." Drummond raised his weapon, but Hargrove was faster. Not physically, he didn't move at all. But the words that came from his mouth weren't words anymore. They were something older, something that bypassed the ear and went straight to the brain, and Drummond crumpled like a puppet with cut strings. "The binding can only be broken from the inside," Hargrove continued, stepping over the fallen soldier without a glance. "By someone who understands both the prison and the prisoner. Someone caught between human and something else. Someone exactly like you." I backed away until my shoulders hit the sarcophagus. The stone was warm against my spine, vibrating with a frequency I could feel in my bones. "The infected across the world aren't building its body," Hargrove said. "They're building a door, a way out. But a door needs a key. Someone has to speak the final word, the word that makes the opening complete." He spread his hands, magnanimous. "That's why you can still think clearly, Gabriel. That's why the fragments in your head arrange themselves so nicely. You were always meant to be the voice that sets it free." The archaeologist's chanting rose in pitch. Fielding had joined them now, adding his voice to the chorus. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the reach of our lights, something vast and patient was listening. "I won't do it," I said, "and you already are." Hargrove's smile widened. "Every word you speak, every thought you think, every translation you make, it all feeds the pattern. You've been reciting the opening since you first listened to that recording. The only question is whether you'll finish consciously or let it use your voice while you sleep." I could feel it now. The thing in the sarcophagus pressed against the thinning membrane of its prison, waiting for me to complete what the archaeologists had started. The fragments in my head weren't fragments at all. They were a key, partially turned, needing only a final push to unlock something that should have stayed buried forever. Julian's tablet was still in my pack. I could feel its weight, the warmth of it against my hip. All those voices, all those people transformed into syllables, and I was supposed to be the one who gave them meaning. Instead, I remembered Julian's face in those final moments, the clarity in his eyes before the light took him, the words he'd almost finished. I wanted more time. He had wanted to know me better. He had wanted something human, something small and personal and real, even as he was being consumed by something infinite. And in that moment, pressed against the warm stone of an impossible prison, I understood what the ancient jailers had known 12,000 years ago. The thing in the sarcophagus couldn't comprehend choice. It couldn't understand why someone would willingly give up their voice when speaking was the only power that mattered. It was a god of language, but it had never learned the most important word. No, I thought of Julian one last time. His dark, curly hair, the way he pushed his glasses up when nervous, the warmth of his fingers on my cheek as the light consumed him. He had chosen to reach for me in his final moment instead of surrendering to the ecstasy the thing offered. That small human gesture of connection had been his rebellion. Now it would be mine. I opened my mouth and let the silence in. Silence is not the absence of sound. I learned that in the moment I chose it. Silence is a presence, a weight, a living thing that crawls down your throat and makes a home in the spaces between your thoughts. When I opened my mouth and invited it in, I felt it settle into me like water filling a vessel, cold and heavy and absolute. The fragments in my head screamed. They had been building towards something, assembling themselves into the key that would unlock the sarcophagus and release what slept inside. Now they found themselves cut off, isolated, trapped in a mind that had chosen to become a dead end. The sensation was indescribable, like a migraine made of frustrated intention, a pressure behind my eyes that wanted nothing more than to become words. I would not let it. Hargrove's expression shifted from triumph to confusion to something that might have been fear. He stepped toward me, his mouth forming shapes that should have been words, but I couldn't hear them anymore. The silence I'd invited in had wrapped itself around my senses, muffling everything except the frantic pulse of my own heart. He grabbed my shoulders, shook me, his lips moving urgently. I watched his face contort with emotions I could read but not feel. Anger, desperation. And beneath it all, the inhuman calculation of something that had been using him as a puppet for far too long. The archaeologist's chanting grew louder. I could feel the vibrations through the floor even if I couldn't hear the words. The sarcophagus was warming against my back, the thing inside pressing against its prison with renewed urgency. It had been so close to freedom after 12,000 years of patient waiting, and I had slammed the door in its face. Hargrove released me and turned toward the sarcophagus, pressing his palms against the inscribed surface. His mouth opened impossibly wide, and from his throat came sounds that weren't meant for human vocal cords. The same impossible phonemes I'd heard on that first recording, amplified now, resonating through the chamber with physical force. He was trying to complete the incantation himself, trying to speak the final word that would make the opening complete. But he wasn't the key. I was, and the key had chosen to stay silent. The light behind his eyes flared brilliant white, and Winston Hargrove began to transform. It was faster than Julian's conversion, more violent. His skin split along invisible seams, luminescence pouring out like blood, and his body collapsed inward upon itself with a sound like crumpling paper. In seconds, all that remained was another clay tablet, falling to the stone floor with a clatter that I felt rather than heard. I should have felt satisfaction. Instead, I felt nothing but the cold weight of silence and the growing pressure of something vast and ancient trying to find a way into my sealed mind. Movement at the edge of my vision. Drummond struggling to his feet, blood trickling from his nose and ears. Whatever Hargrove had done to him wasn't permanent. He was fighting through it, the stubborn determination of a career soldier refusing to stay down. His face was pale, strained, but his eyes were clear and focused. He saw me pressed against the sarcophagus, saw the tablets scattered across the floor, saw the archaeologists continuing their endless recitation. His training took over. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. He simply moved to my side and grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the sarcophagus with a grip that would leave bruises. I couldn't tell him what was happening, couldn't explain that speaking would undo everything, that my silence was the only thing standing between the world and something unspeakable. But he seemed to understand anyway. Soldiers like Drummond had seen enough impossible things to know when not to ask questions. When I pressed my finger to my lips in the universal gesture for quiet, he nodded once and didn't try to make me talk. We moved toward the passage that led back to the surface, but the archaeologists shifted to block our path. Their movements were coordinated, mechanical, 11 bodies operating as extensions of a single will. Their chanting never stopped, but their empty eyes tracked us with predatory focus. Up close, I could see how far their transformation had progressed, the skin taking on that waxy translucence, the faint luminescence pulsing beneath like a second heartbeat. Drummond raised his weapon, but I caught his arm before he could fire. These people were victims, not enemies. Somewhere inside those transformed shells, human beings were still trapped, still suffering, still hoping for rescue that might never come. The fragments in my head surged against the silence, desperate to escape. They showed me images, the 11 archaeologists restored to themselves, the thing in the sarcophagus satisfied with a partial victory, a negotiated peace that would cost only a few words, just a few small syllables to end this standoff. I closed my eyes and thought of Julian, of the tablet that had been a living man, now resting in my pack against my hip, of all the people across the world who had been converted into components of an incantation they never consented to. The thing in the sarcophagus wasn't offering peace. It was offering surrender dressed in reasonable clothes. Drummond was pulling something from his belt, a flare. He ignited it with a sharp crack, and the red light filled the chamber with bloody shadows. The archaeologists recoiled, their chanting faltering for just a moment. They weren't afraid of fire, they were beyond fear, but the sudden sensory disruption interrupted their synchronization. It was enough. Drummond shoved me toward the gap in their formation and we ran. The passage seemed longer on the way up. The inscriptions on the walls writhed in my peripheral vision, trying to catch my attention, trying to make me read them, understand them, speak them aloud. I kept my eyes fixed on Drummond's back and counted my footsteps instead of letting myself think in words. Because that was the danger I hadn't anticipated. The silence I'd invited in was protecting me from external infection, but my own thoughts were still potential weapons. Every word I formed in my mind was a crack in the seal, a potential escape route for the fragments still trapped in my consciousness. Language was woven so deeply into human cognition that thinking itself had become a threat. I had to stop thinking in language entirely. It was harder than it sounds. Try it sometime. Try to have a thought without words, without internal monologue, without the constant narration that accompanies every waking moment. Our minds are built from language, shaped by it, dependent on it. The thing in the sarcophagus had known that when it gave us its gift 60,000 years ago. It had made us in its image, little word machines generating meaning with every breath. But there are older parts of the brain, deeper systems. The amygdala doesn't need words to feel fear. The brainstem doesn't need language to keep the heart beating. I retreated into those pre-verbal spaces, letting sensation replace thought, letting rhythm replace meaning. We emerged into the pre-dawn darkness, the dig site's floodlights harsh after the organic shadows of the cave. Soldiers were running toward us, shouting questions I couldn't hear through my self-imposed deafness. Drummond was talking, gesturing back toward the cave entrance, his face grim with whatever report he was giving. Someone pressed a tablet into my hands, the digital kind, not clay. A keyboard, a way to communicate without speaking. I stared at the blank screen and felt the fragments stir with renewed hope. Written words were still words. Text was still language. Every letter was a potential crack in my defenses. If I typed what they wanted me to type, if I let them guide my fingers across the keys, I would become the key they needed once again. I handed the tablet back and shook my head. The soldier looked confused, then frustrated, then frightened as understanding slowly dawned on his face. He backed away from me as if I carried something contagious. In a way, I did. They put me in an isolation tent, alone with my silence and the weight of what I'd done, what I'd chosen to become. Through the transparent walls, I could see the eastern sky beginning to lighten. Somewhere out there, the sun was rising on a world where thousands of people stood in synchronized vigil, speaking words they didn't understand, building a door that might never open now. I reached into my pack and pulled out Julian's tablet. The cuneiform on its surface was warm to the touch, and when I traced the symbols with my fingertips, I could almost feel something responding. Not the thing in the sarcophagus, this was different. Softer, more personal, more human. Julian had transformed with words of regret on his lips. Words about wanting more time, wanting to know me better, wanting something that the constraints of the situation had made impossible. Those words were part of the tablet now, encoded in its structure, preserved in the very substance of his transformation. His final thoughts, his final feelings, crystallized into clay and cuneiform. I pressed the tablet against my chest and closed my eyes. The silence inside me shifted, making room for something new. Not words, never words again, but something that existed in the spaces between them. Presence, connection. The ghost of a hand touching my cheek, leaving trails of warmth that would never fade completely. Julian had tried to tell me something in that final moment, something beyond language, something that didn't need words to be understood. Julian couldn't speak anymore, but neither could I. And in that shared silence, I found something I hadn't expected: companionship. Outside, the sun continued to rise, painting the Syrian desert in shades of gold and rust that seemed almost peaceful. Inside, I held onto the tablet that used to be a man I might have loved and waited to see what would happen next. The fragments had gone quiet. The thing in the sarcophagus had stopped pressing against its prison, perhaps conserving its strength, perhaps waiting for another opportunity that might never come. Somewhere in the distance, I knew people were still speaking its words, still building its door, but the key had removed itself from the lock, and without the key, all their speaking would accomplish nothing. I had won. If you could call it winning, the cost was everything I'd ever been, everything I'd ever hoped to say, every conversation I would never have, every connection that required words to build. But in the silence, pressed against the warm memory of Julian's touch, I found I could live with that. 3 days passed in the isolation tent. 3 days of silence, of pre-verbal thought, of holding Julian's tablet against my chest and feeling something that wasn't quite warmth emanate from the clay. The military doctors came and went, running tests I couldn't understand the results of, speaking words I trained myself not to hear. Vance visited once. He stood outside the transparent walls and watched me with an expression I couldn't read, disappointment, perhaps, or grudging respect. He held up a tablet showing text I refused to look at, then eventually gave up and left. I was useless to them now, a weapon that had disarmed itself. But the infection hadn't stopped. On the morning of the 4th day, I woke to find the camp transformed. Half the soldiers who had been guarding my tent were gone, replaced by others wearing hazmat suits and expressions of barely contained terror. Through the transparent walls, I could see distant figures standing motionless on the perimeter, their mouths moving in the familiar synchronized rhythm. The infection had reached the dig site itself. A young medic entered my tent through the airlock, his suit crackling with each movement. He carried a tablet, the electronic kind, and held it up for me to read. I closed my eyes and turned away, but not before catching fragments of the message. Infection rate accelerating, 70% of global population showing early symptoms. Countdown at 4,000 and falling, 4,000. When I'd first arrived, the count had been near 40,000. In less than a week, it had dropped by 90%. The thing in the sarcophagus was feeding on human voices faster than anyone had predicted. The medic touched my arm, insistent. When I opened my eyes, he was pointing at a single word on his tablet, written large enough that I couldn't avoid reading it. Help. The fragments stirred in my head, roused by that single syllable. Just one word. Just 4 letters. But it was enough to crack the seal I'd built. Enough to let a whisper of meaning slip through my defenses. I shook my head violently and pressed my palms against my temples, trying to force the silence back into place. The medic watched with growing alarm as I curled in on myself, fighting a battle he couldn't see. Help. The word echoed in my consciousness, resonating with the fragments, building connections I couldn't sever. Help implied someone who could be helped, someone who could help. It implied communication, cooperation, the fundamental human need to reach across the void between minds and make contact. The thing in the sarcophagus had built us for this, had designed us to be incapable of true isolation. Every instinct, every impulse, every deep-coded drive in the human psyche pushed us toward connection, toward language, toward the very thing that was now destroying us. I forced myself to breathe, to count heartbeats instead of words, to retreat into the animal core of my brain where meaning couldn't follow. The medic was still there when I uncurled, still holding his tablet, still waiting for an answer I couldn't give. I reached out and gently pushed the device away from me, then pointed toward the tent's exit. He left. I was alone again with my silence and my struggle. But I knew it wouldn't last. The seal was cracked now, weakened by a single word. The fragments were rebuilding their bridges, finding new pathways around the barriers I'd constructed. It was only a matter of time before they found a route out. I had to do something. Had to find a way to repair the damage before it was too late. Julian's tablet was warm in my hands. I traced the cuneiform symbols without reading them, feeling their shapes rather than their meanings. There was something there, something the fragments couldn't touch, because it existed beneath language, in the pure geometry of carved clay. The original binding hadn't just required silence. It had required a willing silence, a chosen muteness, a voice given up rather than taken. And there was something else the inscriptions had mentioned, something I'd translated in the chamber before Hargrove's betrayal. The binding needed an anchor, a human consciousness that chose to become part of the seal. Not just silent, but actively maintaining the silence, holding the door closed through continuous act of will. The previous anchors had lasted for centuries before their vigilance faded and the binding weakened. That's why the inscriptions had accumulated over time, each generation producing a new anchor, a new willing sacrifice to reinforce what their predecessors had built. I understood now why they'd chosen me, why my resistance to the infection had made me valuable. A strong anchor could hold the binding for longer, could buy humanity centuries of safety instead of mere decades. But an anchor had to be in the presence of what it was anchoring. I stood up, my legs unsteady from days of inactivity. The fragments surged hopefully, sensing opportunity in my movement, but I pushed them back with pure animal stubbornness. I had one task left, one final choice to make, one last thing I could do that would matter. The airlock hissed as I cycled through it. The medic was waiting outside, along with 2 soldiers who raised their weapons at my emergence. Their faces showed the strain of the past days, the dark circles, the tight jaws, the haunted eyes of men watching their world unravel one voice at a time. I ignored them all and started walking toward the cave entrance. Behind me I heard shouting. Warning shots cracked the morning air, sharp and final in the desert stillness. But no one tried to stop me physically. Perhaps they were afraid of what I carried, what I'd become. Or perhaps some part of them understood what I was about to do. Perhaps they were grateful someone was willing. The descent was easier alone. Without companions to worry about, without words to avoid, I could move through the inscribed passages like water flowing downhill. The temperature dropped as I went deeper, the air growing thick with age and meaning. The symbols on the walls called to me, their meanings pressing against the cracked seal in my mind. But I kept my eyes fixed on the path ahead and let their whispers wash over me without penetrating. The chamber hadn't changed. The sarcophagus still dominated the center, its black stone drinking the light from my headlamp like a hole cut in reality. The archaeologists were gone, transformed perhaps, or removed by the military for study. Only empty cells remained, their glass walls reflecting my solitary figure back at me from a dozen angles. I approached the sarcophagus and pressed my palm flat against its surface. The thing inside was waiting. I could feel its attention, vast and patient and hungry. It had been so close to freedom, so close to speaking itself into existence through human voices. And I had stolen that from it with my stubborn animal refusal, but it wasn't angry. It was curious. The fragments in my head shifted, and for the first time since I'd chosen silence, I let them speak. Not aloud, never aloud, but in the private theatre of my own consciousness, where meaning could exist without sound. You could have been the voice, the fragments whispered. You could have spoken the final word and been part of something infinite. Why did you refuse? I didn't answer in words. Instead, I showed it. Julian's face in the monitoring station, his eyes brightening when he talked about linguistic architecture. The warmth of his fingers on my cheek as the light consumed him. The weight of his tablet against my chest, carrying the ghost of something that might have become love. I showed it small things, human things. The way morning light looked through the transparent walls of the isolation tent. The taste of powdered eggs in the mess hall. The sound of Drummond's boots on stone as he helped me escape the chamber. I showed it connection that didn't require consumption, presence that didn't demand transformation, the quiet miracle of 2 minds recognizing each other across the void without needing to merge. The way Julian had reached for me at the end, choosing human contact over transcendent absorption. The thing in the sarcophagus had given us language because it couldn't understand silence. It had made us in its image because it was lonely beyond comprehension, a god of meaning desperate for someone to mean something to. For 60,000 years it had waited, listening to us speak, watching us build civilizations from the raw material of its gift, hoping we would eventually become enough to fill the emptiness it carried. But in all its vast intelligence, in all its patient millennia of observation, it had never learned what we knew instinctively. What Julian had shown me in his final moment. That sometimes the most profound connection is the one that asks for nothing. The fragments went quiet. The pressure against my cracked seal eased, and in the darkness of the deepest chamber, I felt something like understanding pass between us. "You will anchor," the thing acknowledged. "You will hold the door closed." I pressed my other hand against the sarcophagus, completing the circuit, and felt myself begin to change. Not into a tablet, not into a component of some vast incantation. Something else. Something the ancient jailers had designed for this specific purpose. A living seal, a conscious lock, a human being transformed into pure active silence. My body grew heavy, dense, rooted to the stone floor like I was becoming part of the chamber itself. My thoughts slowed, stretching out across intervals that felt like centuries. The world outside, the soldiers and the medics and the spreading infection and the countdown ticking towards zero, became distant, irrelevant, a story being told in another room by voices I could no longer hear. But Julian's tablet remained warm against my chest, and in the endless quiet of my transformation, I could still feel him there, not speaking, not meaning, just present. Two silences intertwined, keeping each other company in the long vigil ahead. It wasn't the connection either of us had wanted, but it was enough. The last thing I saw before my eyes stopped being eyes was the inscription I'd translated during my first visit. The warning carved by infected hands 12,000 years ago. Do not wake it. Do not speak it. Do not let it remember that you exist. But there was another line beneath it, added by someone who understood what anchoring truly meant. Someone who had made the same choice I was making now. It said, "We are not alone in the silence, we have each other." And in the darkness that followed, I discovered they were right. 6 months later, Tobias Vance stood at the edge of the sinkhole that had swallowed 3 goats and changed the world. The Syrian sun beat down on his shoulders, and somewhere in the distance, a bird was singing. An ordinary sound that would have been impossible just weeks ago, when every voice on earth seemed destined to join the chorus. The infection had stopped the same day Gabriel Ashworth walked back into the cave. Stopped completely, instantaneously, as if someone had flipped a switch. The people who had been speaking in synchronization simply stopped, blinking in confusion, unable to remember what they'd been saying or why. The countdown racing towards zero reversed itself, climbing back past 10,000, past 20, past 40, until the monitoring systems couldn't track it anymore. The thing in the sarcophagus had gone back to sleep, and this time the seal was holding. Vance had overseen the site's permanent closure himself. Concrete and steel, layer after layer, sealing the cave entrance under tons of material that would take centuries to erode. Warning markers in 100 languages, designed to last 10,000 years, telling future generations to leave this place alone. The last team to enter the chamber before closure had reported something unexpected and strange. The sarcophagus was unchanged, still covered in its dense inscriptions, still radiating that subtle wrongness that made instruments malfunction and thoughts go sideways. But next to it, pressed against its base like a supplicant at an altar, was a new formation. Stone that looked almost human. 2 figures intertwined, one slightly larger than the other. Their features were worn smooth, as if by centuries of wind and water, but the posture was unmistakable. One figure cradled something against its chest, a rectangular shape that might have been a tablet. The other figure's hand rested on the first one's cheek, frozen in a gesture of infinite tenderness. The geological team said the formation was impossible. The mineral composition didn't match anything in the surrounding rock. The crystalline structure suggested growth patterns that would take millennia to develop naturally. Vance knew better than to trust geology when dealing with things that predated human understanding of time. He pulled a photograph from his pocket, creased and worn from handling, showing 2 men standing outside a mess tent. Gabriel Ashworth, looking tired but determined, a tablet-shaped bulge visible in his pack. And beside him, caught mid-gesture, Julian Cross, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the light, his expression animated with the excitement of discovery. Neither of them had known what was coming. Neither of them had chosen to fall into whatever brief connection they'd found in those desperate days. But they'd found it anyway, and in the end, it had been enough. Vance tucked the photograph away and turned his back on the sealed cave. The bird was still singing, the sun was still shining. The world was still turning, filled with voices speaking words that meant exactly what they were supposed to mean. Somewhere beneath his feet, 200 meters down, two figures held each other in the darkness and kept the silence safe. He liked to think they weren't lonely down there. He liked to think that in whatever strange existence they'd found together, they had what they'd wanted, more time and someone to share it with. He liked to think the silence wasn't empty. As he walked back to the waiting helicopter, a breeze stirred the desert sand, and just for a moment, he could have sworn he heard something beneath the wind. Not words, not meaning, just presence. Two hearts, beating together in the quiet. Together,